Hello, and welcome to another episode for Lingerie and Lattes. As you all know, I have started a segment, and if you don't know who I am, I'm Olivia Tramaga. I founded Vulcan Ability, which is a space for women and men to cultivate self-intimacy, and from that perspective, build relationships that last a lifetime. So, a lot of my philosophies are based around love and figuring out what makes two people work in a relationship together. And all of this is tied to intimacy because we are really lacking an understanding of sensuality in the world. We think we have liberation in our bodies, but in reality, we really have, it would be more about kind of like here's the difference. It's kind of like eating a bunch of candy for dinner and thinking you're satisfied versus having a nourishing meal. So that's where we're at right now in terms of intimacy in the world. People think that if there's multiple choices in terms of partnerships, genders, identities, all these things, you actually have more freedom. But in reality, you don't. You think you have the illusion of freedom. However, if you think about the soul nourishing relationships, that needs connection, that needs vulnerability. And in order to gain vulnerability with one person, you really have to feel open and safe. And for that to transcend among multiple people, as many of these relationships for polygamy are advocating, it's almost illogical for people to assume that you can open up as closely to one person as you can to four others. So this brings me to the topic for today because I came back from my trip with my family. I was spending about a week in Egypt, and there's a completely different culture that I'm used to, given that I've grown up in America and I have my Polish background, has been a lot more welcoming towards feminine, um, feminine essence and its role in society. I want to be very careful how I share what my thoughts are around this stuff because I don't want to act as if any culture is more superior. These are simply my musings around the experiences I've encountered. And especially in lingerie and lattes, you will find much more of my personal philosophy rather than any sort of research or educational content that I typically put out. So I just want to put a preface there. So the differences that I kind of noticed and I was really curious about is the adoption of a culture in Egyptian Islamic culture where you can have multiple wives. Now, I know this is a pretty controversial subject for many reasons, and I know that we have this also in America for certain select population of Mormons. And we were speaking with some of the locals. It was really fascinating for me to hear how they viewed women, and it made me really connect some of the dots around these subjects. So I remember one of the statements that a man who had, I don't remember how many wives, but he said that their culture finds women to be very, very special, like gold. And he was struggling for a little bit, and then he finally used the word private. He views women as gold and private. Now, these were extremely interesting words of choice because if you think about the idea of a man marrying multiple women, if you take away all of the cultural associations with it, if you step away from what you've been preconceived to believe that it's wrong or right or wherever you're standing upon that, I teach everything around relationships that is rooted in love. So I've even debunked the idea of polygamy because of my analogy regarding a consultant with multiple clients versus one dedicated client and project. So when you have your attention focused on multiple clients, some of these clients are going to get more attention, others are going to get less. You're going to feel more connected to one client versus another, and so forth. Versus if you just have one project to focus on, that project is going to take 100% of your dedication, and you're really able to go further because of that laser focus. And this is the same thing in relationships. So if we think about love is already pretty difficult to understand or try to sustain in a relationship. A lot of people think that. Usually that's because of a misconstrued emphasis on love versus effort versus passion. These are different aspects of a relationship. So most of the time people think that there's no love, but really there's maybe not much passion due to lack of effort on both ends. However, if we get back to this idea of love, I started thinking about the statement of being like gold, and the private aspect is pretty self-explanatory. If you don't know, a lot of the women now in the last 30 years have had to shift the way that they dress due to a new government in Egypt. And 30 years ago, there was a lot more mini skirts, shorts, women dressing however and freely they felt like. Due to a new political order, they now have to be entirely covered up, completely different. 30 years is not that big of a difference, so the generations are well aware of changes that have occurred. Now, this gold part and the multiple women. So there's a limit to the amount of wives people in Egypt can have. It's up, well, men particularly, there's up to 4. And we were listening to how the process goes when somebody decides to get married. So if you decide to have a wife, you have to set up her house for her. You have to buy her a house, make sure the kitchen is well equipped, make sure that there is a washing machine, dryer machine, all these particular fundamentals in order to get married. That's number one. And then this local was describing to us that within a year, if the couple is not able to get pregnant, the man will more likely than not divorce the woman and go just find someone else, because the woman's role, there's an expectation within a year of marriage to be pregnant. Whether the fault is of the man or the woman, that doesn't really matter. It's simply kind of like it's an expectation you're meant to met, is my point. So if we consider the idea of gold, and if we all know it's been backed, gold has backed currency for a certain amount of years. Now it's been taken off the gold standard and it's basically just paper, nothing money. So gold is tied to a certain value. Now, my challenge here on this subject is that a woman is supposed to be priceless. She's supposed to be seen as a human, which doesn't have a limit to what they can provide into the world, because they're pretty much, I mean, as we know, I mean, women bring just as much, if not more value as men do into this universe. So comparing a woman to gold and allowing a certain limit of wives into a man's world, that to me, if I followed the dots, connecting them backwards, meant that a woman had a certain value. There's a limit, there's a cap, a ceiling. And in order to get more value, you can't get that from one woman. You have to include more women here. So 4 women is supposed to be equivalent to, let's say, like a mansion versus a trailer park, right? Now, I went further into this analogy and I kept thinking this through. If you have to set up a home, if you have to have a certain amount of income, if you have to have approval from the parents, whether you can sustain the woman or not, there's an economic barrier to whether you're able to have 1 wife or 4 wives. And I'm going to let you just sit with that for one moment. There's an economic barrier to how many wives a man can have in this culture. What that meant to me is that this is not a partnership based on love. I think that's becoming very clear to us here. This partnership is more about transactional gain. And as we are hearing, it's more leaning towards the man's role and the man's preference in the world. So if a woman is able to be valuable and priceless on her own, there should be no way to accumulate value by adding in more women to the mix. I hope this is making sense. If there's an economic barrier to how many wives someone can have in a culture, that automatically eliminates that marriage is based on love. If marriage is not based on love, it becomes transactional. It becomes a business transaction, essentially. So in a business transaction, if one person is in control and is able to have, if it's one man to four women, that inherently means women are worth less than a man because you're not able to you're not able to balance that out just by one person. You're supposed to be able to increase your value, increase your assets. And the only way for them to increase their assets is by literally bringing in more women because one woman can't make herself more valuable from their perspective. So what I want to share here is that while I'm picking on this specific subject of multiple wives with one man, I truly think this is not limited to this culture. That's why I want to be very open about this. I'm not bashing on any one religion. I'm not bashing on any one mentality in the world. I'm simply bringing up a perspective and dissecting it. So if we want to act as if that is okay, polygamy is okay, having multiple wives to one man is okay, we now have to be okay with the fact that this is a transaction and women are worth less than men and they have a cap. If we are not okay with that, then it goes against the reality of having multiple wives. Because if there was no economic barrier, if there was no limitation of, let's say you can't have four wives, you can have how many wives you want, and there was no limitation of you have to set up a house for her, you have to make sure this is set, XYZ is met, then, somebody can claim, I fell in love with 15 other women and I want to marry them all. And that's just my decision. That's how I feel. That's my reality. That's my truth, which is not a real truth. It's solipsism, which is a truth based on your code, but it's not based in reality. It's not part of natural law, and natural law is absolute truth. So we have to be okay with that. Now I'm going to challenge this again and ask you, are you okay with the idea of women being seen as a certain price point, a certain value? Gold loses its value. Gold goes up in value. It has a limit. You invest in a piece of gold today, in 1500 years, it might be worth nothing. It might be worth something. A human life is not supposed to be tied to any sort of value in that way. It's not supposed to be meant in a monetary number. It's not supposed to be capped to a certain degree. So I mentioned that this is transcending this specific culture, and it is, because a lot of the times, and this is a subject I'm going to do in a segment I've now started called Monogamous Seductress, asking, why do people get married? If we don't think in this way in our modern American culture nowadays, or most of the Western world, we do see women as priceless. We see them as equal human beings in our space and all of that. Why do people get married? And I think we can argue most of the time it's not based in love. It's most of the time is based in security, fear, financial reasons, legal reasons, societal reasons, shoulds, all those questions that come up for people. So we need to look at the culture of relationships. We need to look at the dynamics of why people are in relationships and what it means for them. Because I'm going to say most of them are based on this transactional model. And some people are participating in it without being fully aware that that's what they're allowing themselves to be in. That concludes our Lingerie and Lattes. I hope this was educational for you, and you will meet with us next week on Fridays, 11:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, and have an absolutely magical day.